Joe Biden's losses on climate change and voting rights show just how weak the administration's position currently is. Rumours swirl of a top-level Chinese defector with news of the truth about the origin of COVID-19, and early sequences of the virus are discovered after they were attempted to be deleted by Chinese researchers. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Joe Biden announced with a flourish a bipartisan deal for infrastructure spending this week, a significantly slimmed down but still sizable bill to help repair roads, rails and bridges, to fund public transport modernisation and the like. What was mostly dropped from the original bill were a series of measures designed to address climate change. Although it did make provision for the electrification of vehicles, and it includes $47 billion to help communities to become more resilient to disasters and to severe weather events. But gone is the president's clean electricity standard requiring energy companies to gradually switch energy sources, and gone are clean energy tax incentives. These were things you may or may not support, but they were only really disguised as infrastructure. The Biden administration aims to include them in a second package to follow that they will aim to get passed via the budget reconciliation process, which means it could pass through the Senate with a straight majority, rather than needing a 60-40 majority. Now that may be tricky, because it's not clear that they fit the definition that would allow them to pass under that mechanism. And that would be a huge blow to Biden, who just last week was projecting his presidency as a return for America to climate leadership of the world. If he is unable to deliver measures to put his ambitious promises into action, then it will be a much weakened hand that he takes to the COP26 climate summit in Scotland later this year. The weirdest expression of where Americans find themselves politically can be seen in the failure this week of Democrats' wide-ranging voting mechanism bill, the For the People bill. You had both sides talking in apocalyptic and alarmist terms about what the other side were allegedly trying to do. On the one hand, you had Democrats describing the bill in terms of fundamental voting rights, claiming that democracy itself was under threat by what it described as aggressive attempts by Republicans at state level to restrict voting. President Biden even compared those state laws to the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation, which is extraordinary and inflammatory. This was must-pass legislation, they said. It would be the biggest overhaul of federal election laws in over 50 years, setting national standards for early and mail voting, banning partisan gerrymandering, and creating public finance schemes for campaigns, as well as protecting the rights of minority voters. On the other hand, Republicans called the bill the biggest power grab in the history of the country, said it would mandate ballot harvesting and ban voter ID, making wide-scale cheating easier. It would do away with states being able to redistrict when you have population shifts, and enable voting by people not legally entitled to vote. The truth is, it's just strategically weird that this became an early priority for the Democrats, given Biden's opening pitch that he was going to be the unity president. To then place so much political capital on one of the most divisive exercises, a partisan approach to reform of the election process, doesn't really make objective sense. And let's be clear, all the rhetoric aside, that's what it is. Calling it a voting rights bill and talking about such rights being suppressed is largely political rhetoric, because voting rights are protected. According to election law scholar Derek Muller, the laws being passed in different states by Republican administrations fall somewhat short of the horror stories that are being told about them. He said this: "These election bills marginally increase the difficulty for some voters by reducing some of the options, whether it's voting by mail or early voting. But many of these bills also expand voting opportunities, and many of them are tinkering at the margins of expansions during the COVID pandemic in 2020. In some circumstances, voters are no worse off than they were in 2018, and in some circumstances they are better off. So while there's a lot of heated rhetoric, I would say the changes to election law so far have been fairly modest. In some areas where you could argue that the voting became harder, it's not even obvious that it's a problem. It depends on how we define harder. Let's pick a law in Iowa. You could request absentee ballots up until 10 or 11 days before the election, and now it's up until 15 days before the election. Is that harder? You can still show up and vote on election day, you can still vote early, it's just that the window of opportunity to request an absentee ballot has narrowed. Whether the changes are necessary or not, that's another matter. For a number of Republican states, the motivation seems to have been as much about appeasing the losers of the 2020 election and addressing a perceived problem for which there wasn't much concrete evidence as they were about solving an actual experienced problem. Not that there aren't problems that could do with solving. Both parties have been guilty of gerrymandering, redrawing district maps to benefit their side when they have that opportunity. To their credit, some Democrat administrations have instead formed independent commissions to handle the job, which is much the way it's done in the UK, overseeing the application of a non-partisan formula. And those often came in for harsh criticism from some of their other colleagues who feel they're then not playing by the same rules as the other side and putting themselves at disadvantage. But increasingly the fights are getting uglier. Republicans have been quick to allege fraud. Democrats are similarly quick to allege voter suppression, even against themselves, by the way. In the New York primary race for mayor, Eric Adams, the black former police officer, argued that an alliance between Andrew Yang and Catherine Garcia was a form of voter suppression intended to disenfranchise black voters, because identity politics has poisoned the discourse more thoroughly on this issue than just about anywhere else. In any case, the For the People bill was defeated and deserved to be. Election reform should never be a partisan process. Moderate Democrat Joe Manchin stood up for integrity on this when he said this: "Today's debate about how best to protect our right to vote and hold elections, however, is not about finding common ground, but seeking partisan advantage. Whether it is state laws that seek to needlessly restrict voting or politicians who ignore the need to secure our elections, partisan policymaking won't instill confidence in our democracy, it will destroy it." So why did Democrats place so much political capital on this bill when it was so likely to be defeated and to leave them with no momentum or successes in the run-up to the midterm primaries? Some have debated whether Democratic leaders truly wanted the bill to become law in the first instance. There were numerous disagreements about its specifics within the party, with some of its anti-gerrymandering reforms being particularly controversial, for example. The argument goes that by holding a vote on a relatively radical bill, they were signalling to activists that they are on their side and committed to far-reaching action. But at the same time, they could signal to the moderates within their ranks who were unhappy with parts of the bill that it didn't really matter because it had no realistic chance of becoming law anyway. Others have suggested that it was pushed to attempt to provide a powerful lever to motivate moderates to end the filibuster rules, which was a major miscalculation. If that was true, it was the least likely bill that was going to achieve that. But these are the games politicians play. It's a remarkable zero-sum game for a party newly in government, a real reflection of the actual weakness of their position. Now, in other news, rumours have been swirling of a high-level Chinese security officer who defected to the US. And there have been other developments as well on the COVID origin story. We will come to those in just a minute. But first, until relatively recently, not many of us had heard of the term mRNA. But in 2021, the year of COVID-19, the arrival on the scene of the mRNA vaccines has been one of the headline stories. Certain conventional vaccines, such as the AstraZeneca Oxford one, have proven to be extremely effective, but those using the new mRNA technology have proven to be just that bit better. But not universally so. While the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines have been riding high, another mRNA-based contender, the CureVac vaccine, turned in disappointing results, being just 47% effective in preventing disease. So it's not a miracle technology that can never fail. But it did provoke excited discussion for the potential to address other diseases that have so far been resistant to medication, and predictions that vaccine production for any future pandemic could be reliably faster than it has been in the past. Then there are also people sounding notes of caution, or even notes of alarm. They argue that the rapid rollout of the technology equates to a huge-scale experiment on the human race where it would have been prudent to move more carefully. Because it's so different to what came before, a more precautionary approach might have been appropriate. And there are others who highlight that they believe there are genuine harms and have tried to argue where they think these come from. So what's the background behind how this new type of medicine works? What is really the potential? And what are the valid concerns and criticisms that we should be listening to? And what's the story behind the person who claims to be the inventor of mRNA technology, contrary to the mainstream version, who has now become one of the chief alarm raisers? That's what I'll be covering in next Monday's video, going live on this channel at 7 PM UK time. Join me then. There were numerous stories over last week about the rumour of a Chinese defector, a top counterintelligence official, Dong Jingwei, who was supposed to be in the care of the US government. Dong is, or was, the number 2 official in the Ministry of State Security, and he's said to have escaped from China along with his daughter around 5 months ago. China is said to have been furious and to have demanded that he be returned, but it's all rumour. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't traditionally admit the defection of MSS officers. For instance, they still haven't admitted the defection of Yu Qiangsheng, who defected to the US back in 1985. China's government-supported media suggested that Dong had appeared at an MSS seminar, but there were no photos, no details of where the event took place, so it's not clear how reliable that report might be. Some sources on the Trump-supporting right have been awash with suggestions that the defector has been giving all sorts of details about the Wuhan lab leak theory. They suggested that the defector had confirmed it came from an accidental leak at the lab, with a suggestion it was working on producing new variants to suggest that it came from a natural crossover from bats. And some went further and said that the defector had said that COVID-19 was part of a bioweapons program. Now, I would treat all of those stories with extremely low credence, to be honest. I've reported here in detail about the circumstantial evidence supporting the lab leak theory and added that I find it a credible possibility amongst others. But rumours like this that conveniently match a group's committed view of something for which we have no conclusive proof, you have to be very suspicious of those in the absence of concrete evidence. I mean, if they turn out to be true, then it will be a game changer, obviously. And it could well be the reason why the Biden administration has said that it wants a new report on virus origins. Or it could just be a rumour, because such rumours of defections are very common and they spread because neither China nor US administrations ever comment upon suggestions of defections. And specifically, when you get things like the bioweapons angle, it's highly unlikely that angle applies because first, the coronavirus doesn't have many of the features that makes for a desirable bioweapon, and second, it was handled in the levels 2 security lab, not the level 4. Anything with the sensitivity of military secret weapons would be unlikely to be dealt with in that way. Some have been pouring cold water on the idea of a defection at all, arguing that the fact that Chinese social media is full of chatter about the story suggests that it's not true. CIA China expert Nicholas Eftimiades told the Spy Talk website if Dong really did defect, the CCP would squelch public discussion. He went on to suggest that if it weren't the case, and he really was with the US administration, details of that will surely leak out in due course. So watch this space. But treat stories claiming certain knowledge of highly specific details as being very suspect unless accompanied by evidence. One interesting note on the Wuhan lab story. The Lancet, the journal that published the letter organised by Peter Daszak early in the pandemic to shut down the criticism of China, it tweeted this week that it had invited all of the authors of that letter to reconsider whether they had interests that they needed to register. You'll recall that, in spite of the fact that Daszak had worked directly with the Wuhan Institute on gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses, that letter was published declaring that none of the authors had competing interests. It turns out that Daszak took up their invitation and produced a piece of text that wasn't so much a declaration of interest as a long piece of campaign polemic, arguing why EcoHealth's work was approved by ethics committees and the like. Rather late, and yet still managing to miss the point. But the fact that it appeared at all at this late stage underlines the degree of heat that is currently being felt by the Lancet. Not only that, but Daszak has been recused from the Lancet COVID-19 Commission into the origins of the disease. It's not a trivial thing. He wasn't just a member of that commission, he was the chair of the commission. And when a letter was submitted to the Lancet to disagree with the February 2020 letter that Daszak had orchestrated, saying that any suggestion of a lab leak was a conspiracy theory, it was referred to that committee before being declined, which simply serves to underline just how ridiculous and blatant a conflict of interest all of that was at the time. The astonishing thing was that it was even remotely viable in the first instance. The UK Daily Mail reportedly contacted the Lancet editor Richard Horton about the decision to publish and support the original letter, and for some reason he declined to comment. Meanwhile, a set of early sequences of SARS-CoV-2 were discovered, having been deleted from an online scientific database at the request of the Chinese researchers who initially posted them there. The samples were from early in the pandemic from cases in Wuhan, but they were deleted a few months after the pandemic spread. However, copies remained in the Google Cloud after deletion, and a researcher who found a reference to them worked out the URL format to access them. The virologist in question, Jesse Bloom, said that it seemed likely the sequences were deleted to obscure their existence. The early sequences are important because they're closer to the spillover event, whatever it looked like. Dr. Bloom said that the newly recovered sequences are 3 steps more similar to the bat coronaviruses than the viruses from the Huanan fish market. Richard Ebright, professor of chemical biology at Rutgers University, told the Financial Times this: "The findings do not shed direct light on the issue of origins. The results do not rule out a natural spillover origin and do not rule in a laboratory spillover origin. They do provide evidence of deliberate obfuscation of early events in the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan in fall 2019 and evidence of deliberate obstruction of the investigation of those events." Independent experts were asked to comment on the preprint paper by Jesse Bloom. Professor of microbial pathogenesis Andrew Preston said this: "The language of the paper is unusual. It contains a significant degree of supposition and conjecture, cites blog posts, and appears to be pointing towards a deliberate cover-up by Chinese authorities of early sequence data from Wuhan. However, this is an entirely subjective appraisal of a situation which will be very difficult to confirm or disprove. If nothing else, the discovery lends weight to the current theory that the Wuhan seafood market was not itself ground zero." Now, in other news, Oxford University has announced that it's to add the antiparasitic drug ivermectin to its large-scale trials to evaluate their effectiveness in treating COVID-19. The focus is on treatment for patients with COVID, not on use as a prophylactic, which has been the source of recent speculation based on a couple of studies of impacts in Africa. But nevertheless, a number of small doctor-led trials had suggested a degree of value as a treatment. So the move will provide a more reliable assessment of whether the observed effects match the optimistic reports to date. It's a poignant development as YouTube continues to enforce its policies on constraining any sort of promotion of ivermectin. Brett Weinstein, who's been going further into that sort of advocacy position over time, has seen videos from his channels taken down with strikes to those channels, which is significant because YouTube has a free strikes and you're out approach. A couple of comments from last week's video. America first has always been America's policy. And why not? The difference between Trump and the rest is that Trump saw it as a zero-sum game. If other countries benefited, then the US must be losing. Every interaction was a transaction. The greater truth is that it is not a zero-sum game, and we can seek win-win interactions. That simple truth seems to be beyond Trump's comprehension. Just because other people gain does not mean we are losing. You're right that America's foreign policy has always been to further its own interests, and that's something that I refer to more generally in the recent Q&A video. This is in the spirit of your comment. But I do think it goes further, because during the Cold War between the West and the Communist Soviet Union, there was a solid sense of a battle for the future between two political philosophies. The tag of leader of the free world wasn't just an idle label, it was the recognition of a real distinction and a real struggle, which is why America committed troops to Europe and became the driving force behind NATO. The promise of NATO that an attack on one would be considered as an attack on all, and that the nuclear weapons umbrella, mostly held by the United States, was therefore covering the free world, not just the United States. And that was all enlightened self-interest, but not exactly what you would describe as America first in the way that Trump defined it. Now, you nailed a part of that difference with your point about the zero-sum game, and that's absolutely right. But it did arguably go further than that. And we are similarly arguably in a equivalent situation again today, except that the alliance of democracies seems not to be so cohesive. Honestly, the boycotts are ridiculous, but are you actually going to sit there and claim the GB News is any way objective or a good news outlet? You always pride yourself of being balanced and fair, and GB News offers nothing like this. Which is rather disappointing because, as you rightly point out, there does need to be a credible right-wing news outlet to keep the balance. But really, GB News ain't it. Now, I didn't make any such claims for GB News, except that Andrew Neil is their chief asset, showing his formidable interviewing skills as always, which he was doing again this week, filleting Extinction Rebellion's Roger Hallam in one of the most remarkable interviews of the year. But I said that the channel needed to grow beyond the point where it was held up by the status of one man, which was a polite way of saying that its early output has been undistinguished. Not that it's all bad, but it just needs to sharpen up. As I said, it's early days. It will be easier for GB News to improve, to become the better version of itself, than it will be for anyone to create something new. And if it fails, that will undoubtedly set back the possibilities for a viable alternative. So sometimes you have not to let the perfect become the enemy of the good, or at least could be good with a bit more work. And some working microphones, of course. If you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs. One of the most quoted lines from one of the most quoted poems by Rudyard Kipling, extolling the virtues effectively of stoicism. Right now we live in a world where lots of people are perpetually angry. They're angry because the instant response world of social media makes it easy for disagreements to do a downward spiral. They're angry because the media models based on clicks motivate content creators large and small to focus on the things that generate outrage. And they're angry because we're in a cultural moment where keeping your head in the face of whatever latest outrage has erupted onto Twitter trends today, that is seen now as a moral failing. It's hard to stand against a social norm if it's imbued in your culture. And that's something that has been true forever. It's something that would-be statue topplers don't really understand about the past. But although instant outrage and an angry tone may be on its way to becoming the social norm as it is expressed via social media, doesn't mean it's fully infected the world outside of that. Twitter is still not real life. If you step back from the people trying to convince you that there's a world full of nefarious types whose action should be keeping you in a state of permanent fury, there are few negative consequences, quite a lot of positive ones. So I provoked an angry response from one commenter last week when I gave the scientist Professor Christian Anderson the benefit of the doubt on why he deleted his Twitter account. Not good enough, they raged. An innocent person doesn't delete their account. But they do. People do all sorts of things. And understanding the people who think differently to you is always hard. Since I have no way of knowing why he really did so, still not having mastered that whole mind-reading thing, the world seems a better, more wholesome place if I default to assuming the best and not the worst. And, from my experience of human beings, most of which came from cultural moments in the past, or at least a little bit less angry than the social media influenced one of today, that simple principle will make you right more often than it will make you wrong. Everyone makes mistakes, and everyone occasionally can fall below the standards that they hold for themselves. But they more often rise to their aspirations than they sink to the levels projected onto them by the most cynical and disbelieving of critics. Being quick to hold yourself responsible for your own failings and slow to blame others for what appear at first glance to be theirs, that is the spirit of that old wise poem by Rudyard Kipling. It remains as good advice today as it was when he first wrote it. All right. Thanks to all for the feedback on the new look. It's been hugely positive, much more than I could have anticipated, so I'm glad that you all liked it. You might notice there was no promotion for a Wednesday video this time. I'm leaving open the option of either doing a highly topical discussion video if there's something of interest, or actually just dropping it next week to give myself a bit more time to put the last components of the rebrand into place. I have a schedule that gives me very little time, and it's made it quite difficult to get everything done that needs doing. I've been posting short videos most days on the New Clips channel, so please do sign up to that if you haven't already. I'm not going to evaluate the success of it until several months in, because any new channel takes time to start to gain visibility, but the more of a push you can give it for the algorithm, the more quickly it might get there. It's just one of the measures I'm taking to try to get around the fact that YouTube has decided, for the time being at least, to stop promoting videos from this channel to people who are not already viewers and subscribers. I noted that Kim Iverson, who I mentioned last week had been hit for a video on ivermectin, she made a comment that her own channel has had an identical measure applied to it. So for all that YouTube tends to suggest that shadow banning is not a thing, the evidence is pointing to something very much like it. It's a challenge to have to overcome such barriers. I wouldn't be doing any of this now in the face of all of that if it wasn't for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. That support enables me to look at those obstacles and making something like this successful, and then commit to going all in on it anyway. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.